Hello, welcome to this symposium on the only topic of the day, the coronavirus. My name is Larry Arnn. I work at the college, and I'm going to introduce a friend of mine and one of my most admired people. I just quoted him in Primus. I read him every Monday morning faithfully in something called the Monday Morning Outlook. If you search for that in his last name, you can overwhelm his servers, and I encourage you to do that. His last name is Wesbury, W-E-S-B-U-R-Y. I'll tell one little quick story about him back in 2008 when the whole world was going to pot. There was a conference of economists in New York, and I was there, and I'm not an economist. I'm a man of common sense. But a lot of very distinguished economists, including Nobel Prize winners. And there was a small, what would you call it, Brian? A small conversation among a few of them about how the whole world was going to come to an end. And he predicted in front of all of them that the stock market would be back where it was within 6 months. And I thought that was gutsy. And the reason for that, you're about to find out, is that he just looks at the data. And he's not always optimistic, and he's not always pessimistic. He just looks at the data. So Brian Wesbury, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Larry, it is so great to be with you.
So you're the chief economist at the First Trust Bank, and he's been practicing the dismal art now for decades. And he is, however, also a liberally educated man. And so we're going to talk about what he thinks about all this, because this is unprecedented stuff. And my first question, Brian, is what do you think about all this?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's interesting that you start with 2008 and that crisis, because I actually, when I look back, think that laid, in a way, the groundwork for what we're doing as a government, as a society today. The Federal Reserve pumped trillions of dollars into the economy. Hank Paulson and George Bush, the president at the time, did a $700 billion bailout of the banks. And they did this rather than, and we don't need to get into all of this, but change a really simple accounting rule. Actually, it's not, it's an ugly accounting rule called mark-to-market accounting. And my view is that that's what created the real damage to the economy. And when we finally changed that rule in March of 2009, that's when the economy opened up. And so what we have today, in my opinion, is literally a fiasco caused in a way by the same kinds of things that the government, through its actions, back then it was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that were pushing all the subprime loans, and then mark-to-market accounting that created this bonfire. And then we finally fixed the right thing. But before we did that, we did way too much government action. And now we're doing that again today. And so the bonfire today has been created by these epidemiologists and pandemic experts. And if we kind of think about it, they've been waiting all their lives for a pandemic. And I'm not saying that they wish one on anyone or that they aren't concerned about death. I'm not being cynical about them, but this is what they train for. So whenever they see something coming, MERS or SARS or HIV/AIDS, they start running these models. And these models, we've seen them in the movies, right? Big red dots and lines flying all over the world and transmission and everybody dying. And what's fascinating about these models is that if you go back over history, they almost always, and in fact, I'm going to say virtually always, overestimate the problem. If they were real models, they would half the time overestimate and half the time underestimate. And what I find fascinating is that by giving ourselves into these models, these scientists, we have then done some things that we shouldn't have done. Just like back in 2008 with quantitative easing and TARP, we should not have shut down, in my opinion, our economy like we did. We have found out that these models way overestimated the death and the danger. But as data has come in, we've also found out who's susceptible to dying from this disease. We know who to help, and yet politicians went along with the models because they had to. And this is a kind of a political process, right? Where if I don't go along with the worst case model and I'm a politician, then people can say I killed people. If I do go along with the models and they come in lower, which they were highly likely to do from the very beginning, then I can say, hey, see, I saved people. So the models actually determined political behavior, and in the end, we ended up shutting down the economy. And I believe over the long run, the cure, in this case, shutting down the economy, is going to be way worse than the disease. And we can talk about that, but we have created lasting damage to the U.S. economy. And then the final piece of this puzzle to me is that it's the first social media virus that we have. And so when we add those three things together, models that overestimate, politicians that would be foolish to fight back too hard once those models got out there, and the fear started to rise, and then the social media virus, which literally helps spread panic, and you put those three things together, and I think we've created a real fiasco for the U.S. economy.
I noticed that Mark Zuckerberg said a couple days ago that he's the head of Facebook, that coronavirus deniers, they're called, are going to be filtered out as fringe groups. And
yes.
The power to do that is an interesting power for anybody to have, too.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just a quick aside, I was looking back at, there was a great book written many decades ago about groupthink, and it really studied the Bay of Pigs fiasco under John F. Kennedy. And what we end up with is, because you're forced to make decisions under pressure, and if you decide to go against the grain, then you're called a denier, and we end up, and that's when very often groups, not just the government, but groups make really bad decisions. And I believe what we have today is this group think scenario. Everybody thinks they know, but one of the problems that if you think you know, you really don't know, because all we have is the data that is available, and it's not enough data to make a real decision. And so we've done some antibody tests which show that this thing is spread much wider and further, but everybody ignores those because they don't go along with the group think, the narrative. And so I think that kind of language, which by the way they use with climate change as well, is really dangerous, because it says there's only one path to take. And what I would argue is that those that the coronavirus deniers are the people, I think, like me, who look at the damage and the long-term damage from the economy. We're going to end up killing people because of slower growth over time, because of unemployment today. We all know the reasons: suicide, anxiety, depression, violence in the home. All of these things, people being without a job, multiplies their problems, and no one has included that in the models. And so gosh, if you look at Italy and Spain and France, they have socialized medicine. They've had very little growth for decades. No wonder they have fewer ICU beds per million people, per 100,000 people than the U.S. does. Our healthcare system, it's a lot of, we've got 50% of it is run by government, but it's not Italy, France, or Spain. And that's why our death rates are a lot lower. And so, but that's where we're headed if we don't think about the damage we're doing to the economy. So I would argue that if they want to call me a coronavirus denier, I'm going to call them an economic denier, because they're not seeing the damage that this is going to do over time.
Yeah, and then there's that little factor, the right to make a living. And
right.
To have that by blanket orders, the governor of Michigan is particularly tough. And somebody told me the other day, who's close to the state government, that She has 6 or 8 advisors. Well, of course she has 6 or 8 advisors, right? There's not enough time in the day
Right.
for anybody to consult closely with more people than that. And so
Right.
those 6 or 8 people are busy making lists of what's essential and not essential in the state of Michigan.
Right.
And that's it's our month-long now experiment in socialism.
Right.
So what do
Yeah,
you think the
it's-
economic consequences of this are, Brian?
Yeah, well, just as in the kind of the short term, one of the good things, here we are nearing the end of April. There are states opening up. One of the things that I find fascinating is that Florida, Jacksonville area, opened its beaches within 26 minutes. There were thousands of people on the beach. You can clearly tell what people want. They want freedom, and then New Yorkers are complaining about people being on the beach outside in Florida. In the meantime, the subways are still running in New York City. And by the way, one of the fascinating things about the subways in New York City is they do have fewer riders today. That is absolutely true. But you know what the system did is, in response to fewer riders, they limited the number of trains. They cut the number of trains, which means that even though there's fewer riders, the cars are still full of people. They actually, if they really wanted to do the right thing, they should have increased the number of trains, not decreased the number of trains. And so I find this fascinating how different states are dealing with things. But we're going to see Georgia is moving toward opening. South Carolina is moving toward opening. Many states are. Colorado is moving, and that was one of the harder hit areas in Denver, is moving toward opening. Obviously, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, some of the western states that didn't get hit hard. And as this opens, we're going to start seeing the economy healing. However, there are at least, and we don't have good data on this yet, but I've already heard that in New York City, 10% of restaurants are closed for good. We know that the average small business in America has about 27 days of cash. And yes, the government is throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at them, but a lot of them have given up already. And so let's say we would do a big bang reopening, it all happened at once. Well, we would open up probably with only 92% of our economy intact. And not only that, the new government program of unemployment benefits pays people, for example, in Texas, for the next 4 months, you can get an average wage of $58,000 a year by staying on unemployment benefits. And in many cases, this is more than they would make in their regular job. So what's happening is we're putting a barrier between people sitting at home collecting unemployment or going back to work. And so we've actually damaged our ability to recover. Now, I do think that America will recover. It's going to be more of a U-shaped economic recovery, but the damage is deep and wide. States, municipalities, their budgets are blown apart. We're going to lose, thank goodness, Hillsdale is in great shape, but there are a lot of small liberal arts colleges that are in trouble right now, serious trouble. There are hospitals that are in trouble. The damage goes way deeper than people understand, and I think the pressure on governors to open up is going to grow by the day, partly because the federal government doesn't have enough money to bail them out completely. And then I know we'll get into this in a minute, but one of the things that worries me the most is that we have now set a new precedent, that anytime we start to have a flu, a virus spread, that we're going to shut down the economy again. And if we do that, then the behavior of every citizen in America, the behavior of every company will change. We're going to see people hold a lot more cash, be a lot more wary of life, and that will slow growth down for the long term. And it's going to take a while for us to get back to normal, especially if people think the government's going to react like this at any day.
Well, the tools are in place now. As you said, from 2008, and then this incredible prestige that scientists have.
Right.
I know a story. Winston Churchill had his worst political setback in the First World War. And where it started was the generals had enormous prestige. And the British Constitution doesn't set up a commander-in-chief. It's better now because he reformed some things. And so no politician could stand up to them. And they sacrificed 900,000 British lives fighting back and forth across 2 miles of ground, which they never got beyond that until the war ended. Right. The German army finally broke. But that's, an incredible cost. And Churchill developed a whole account of all this, and his point was really simple. Experts, by definition, can only know one thing really well. But decisions are made by many things. And so, what kind of person would, you're an expert on a par with the greatest epidemiologist, but your expertise teaches you some humility about what you know. And theirs doesn't seem to.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, what I have done from the very beginning, I'm an economist, that's my job, but I'm a mathematician and a statistician. I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not an expert in pandemics, I never have claimed I was, but I know how models work. And I have dug into these models, I have looked at data, and the data said over and over and over again, whether we look at other countries around the world, whether we look back in history, whether we look at the data that we have today, that we were overstating the death rate, overstating a lot of now people are dying, and one of the problems, this is why they call you a coronavirus denier, is that you don't care that people are dying. That's absolutely not true. It breaks my heart. My mother and father are 86 and 85. They live in a retirement community. I worry about them every day. They don't have, the good news is they're in great health. I don't really want to talk about them a lot, but I worry about them every day. They're in an environment that's dangerous. But for most people, this isn't as dangerous. There are studies out already, one in Chelsea, Massachusetts, one in Santa Clara, California, and one in LA, that show the death rate is significantly lower than was initially estimated. That's why these models have gone from 2.2 million to 240,000 to 100,000 to 60,000 because they always overestimate. And it's because it's the fog of war. We don't have enough data, and yet they're using models and assuming that they have data that they don't really have. And then what this does is it causes fear. And then what's fascinating to me is, clearly there's a political dimension to this. And the latest thing everyone has grabbed onto is testing. We have to be able to test more. Well, at the same time, I keep hearing over and over again on TV, reading it in print, that, hey, if you've had COVID-19, you could get it again. That's what a lot of press are reporting. They're interviewing people and doctors that say that. And so then the question I have is, well, then what good is testing? Because if you test negative, well, that means you could get it tomorrow. And if you test as if you have that you have antibodies, well, then they're saying you could get it again. So really what they're saying is you could never do enough testing ever if people can actually get it again. And by the way, if you could get it again, then there's no vaccine that could fix it because antibodies don't work, and that's the way that vaccines work. And so what they've done is they've set up an argument that no one can defeat, and that really scares me. It's almost like climate change. And the one thing that I find fascinating is they said the world was going to end in 12 years with climate change, and that wasn't enough to scare people into letting the government take over their lives. But now they say you could die tomorrow from COVID-19, and now many people have been willing to let the government take over their lives. The good news is we're seeing people across the country say no more. We're not putting up with this. And I think as this spreads, if let's say I have a manufacturing plant in one state, Indiana, and Indiana opens up and I start producing, and you're a manufacturer in Michigan and I'm competing for the same customers, well, guess what? You're going to be pushing your governor to open up too, because now you're going to be losing business. And so as different places start to open up, I think it will spread, and the opening up will spread, and that will get the economy back. But if this is a new paradigm, if this is the new way that we deal with every virus, it's worrisome for the future, because at that point, investing is a lot riskier than it's ever been before. And it's not just because of competition or regular old business cycles, recessions in the economy. It's because at any moment the government may decide we're going to shut down. And I think it's just it's based on models that are flawed, and they won't admit that they're flawed. It's scary, really, when you think about it.
There has to be some systemic reason why these models are continuously wrong. What do you think that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I look at them, I mean, I don't want to act like I'm an epidemiologist here, but as I look at them, there's two things that they are based on, and that is, one, how quickly it spreads, and then how deadly it is. And so if you put in slightly different numbers for those two things, you can come up with numbers like 2.2 million people dying. But here's the problem. We can't measure everyone. So for example, let me run through some data, and I hope I do this well enough so that people can follow the numbers. There's quite a few numbers here. But right now, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, says that in the U.S. for this flu season, 2019 to 2020, somewhere between 39 million and 56 million people have had the flu, okay? Now that is an estimate. It's a complete estimate. All right, now I get it. We have a lot of history with the flu. They're using, it's probably pretty close, okay? However, here's the problem. We've only tested 1.3 million people in the United States. We didn't test 39 million. We didn't test 56 million. We only tested 1.3 million. And of those 1.3 million, 247,000 tested positive for the flu. Now, let's go to look at deaths. Here's what the CDC says about deaths. They say between 24 and 56,000 people a year die from, or this year have died from the flu. So if we use the lowest number, 24,000, divided by the number of positive tests, which is 247,000, it gives you a death rate of about 10%. And when we're dealing with COVID-19, we have not done broad studies to be able to estimate the full number of people that have it. All we know is the number of people that have tested positive. And so when we compare the people who tested positive to the people who have died, we end up with a much bigger death rate than is true, because this COVID-19 has spread much further and much wider than we're able to know today, because we've done a few antibody studies and they show that that's true, but nobody wants to believe them yet, because we haven't done perfectly FDA approved random samples. And this is one of the, by the way, the same thing happens with a vaccine. Everybody keeps saying 18 months. Well, it doesn't take 18 months to make a vaccine. It takes 18 months for the FDA to approve it. And so what's fascinating about this is that the bureaucracies get in the way. They're working with data that is not complete, and they're using numbers that are way too big. And so I think that's one of the reasons why these models consistently overestimate, is that we're always coming in with data that's lacking. I would never make a forecast of the economy with the data that they are using, ever. All right, and yet they're able to shut down the economy with that data, and I think that's a huge mistake.
Do you think there's any relevance to the fact that these big bureaucracies also provide a lot of funding to scientists?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we see it with climate change. There is so much money thrown around to study climate change, and now with pandemics. Plus, if you look at university health departments, many of them get grants from the NIH, from the I'm not sure whether the FDA and CDC provide grants, but I'm sure they're involved in the process. And so the bureaucracies end up this whole world of researchers in this area is pretty small. All right, and I mean they know each other. And that's one of the things that was frustrating to me at the very beginning of this, is that we know the CDC and the FDA messed up that first test. And yet there's 600 people out there, 800, maybe it's 1,600, I'm not even sure, who work in private companies, who work in university labs, who are brilliant, who are just as brilliant as anybody at the CDC or the FDA, but the bureaucracies wouldn't let go. And then finally, they let go. You know, one of the fascinating things that I found out about South Korea is that 90% of the testing that was done in South Korea was done by private companies, 90%. And so no wonder they were able to roll it out as fast as they were. And we haven't done that here. In fact, we're still using government labs to run the tests. Quest Diagnostics, a private company, governors and cities and states and municipalities aren't using their capacity to do tests. And they should be. But what's fascinating is the bureaucracies hold on to the power, and they hold on to the data too. And here's another issue. I didn't even think about it until right now, and that is that in the CARES Act, in that big $2 trillion spending bill, there's a section about Medicare reimbursements for COVID-19 deaths. And if you have a COVID patient that dies in your hospital, you get a 15% boost to the payment for that category of death. Now, I sort of get it. It's combat pay, all right? However, what that does is it creates an incentive. You know, there might be somebody that was only going to live another 2 weeks because they had a congenital heart disease and that was it. But if they have COVID-19, they get categorized as dying by COVID-19, even though we only saved about 2 weeks of their life. Or we only lost, about 2 weeks of their life. And this is a whole nother issue with economics, and this is in a way morbid, and I almost don't like talking about what I'm about to say. But if we kind of look at the number of years of life lost because of COVID-19, it's not like the Spanish flu, which was killing young children, teenagers, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s. It was indiscriminate as depending on age. We know the people that are dying from COVID-19. And so if we compare it to other pandemics, other deadly viruses in the economy, just happens to be that this one is 97% of all the people who have died in New York City had underlying conditions. Most of them multiple underlying conditions. And so their life was already, in a sense, on the edge, and then the virus pushed them over. Now, I want to cry. It's not a great way to go. And so one of the things I want everybody to know is that look, every life is precious. If somebody can be with a family for another 2 or 3 weeks, that's 2 or 3 weeks that's gone. I fully get that. But to shut down the entire economy, and I believe to create much greater long-term healthcare problems, we're not balancing that out. And that's what the pandemic experts don't include in their models, is the damage that comes from long-term slower growth, from bigger government and less freedom and more unemployment. We know that leads to more death, more disease, and shorter lifespans. All we have to do is look anywhere around the world, and we can see that. And so we need to balance those two things out, and that's what I'm suggesting is that the data on the virus isn't great enough to have done the damage that we have done to the economy.
I want to ask you a question about employment and unemployment. It looks to me like one of the glories of the American economy in the last 4 years is the very low rates of unemployment and how employment is reaching into places with low-income people and long-term unemployed where it hasn't been for decades. Why do you think that happened, and how do we get that back?
Yeah, I think it happened for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was an 11-year-long economic recovery, and I get it. It was slow, all right. But when President Trump came in, we were in the 4s in unemployment, and then he was able to push it down to 3.5%, which is the lowest we've seen in 50 years. And I think there's two key reasons for that. Number one, we cut corporate tax rates. The United States had one of the highest, well, in fact, there's a couple of really teeny countries. So if all we do is look at developed countries around the world, we had the highest corporate tax rate in the world. And so what we were doing is we were pushing business to Canada, to Mexico, to China, to France, to Italy, to Spain. I mean, all these countries had lower tax rates than we did. And now what we have done is we have become competitive at 27% and that's including state and federal and state taxes. We've become competitive with all these countries, and we're starting to bring business back to the U.S. Number two, we deregulated. In fact, President Trump deregulated more, in my opinion, than even Ronald Reagan, who up until now was the record holder. But President Trump has done a massive deregulatory effort, which has freed up every time you get rid of a regulation, you free up an entrepreneur to do something else. And so what happened is we were already at low levels of unemployment. We now have to reach into areas where people were reluctant to work because they were getting unemployment benefits and welfare almost on a permanent basis. But now it was more beneficial to get a job. And so we started pulling people out of these areas where up until then they had refused to work. And so the economy picked up a little bit. We had lower tax rates, less regulation, and that's why we were getting to that point. And what's fascinating about this is that would have led to a healthier economy. It would have led to less and more and fewer problems with health, with just about anything. And this is the frustrating part to me, Larry. I know I'm kind of bouncing off onto an angle here, but every dollar that government spends, every dollar that supports a liberal arts college in the middle of Vermont, which is now going bankrupt, comes from the private sector. All right, every dollar. Government does not create wealth. And so what we have done today is literally shut down the wealth-creating mechanism in the economy. And then what happens is I believe people way underestimated the economic damage that would ripple through the economy. For example, in about all food categories, even in toilet paper, there's two different supply chains. One goes to the individual through the grocery store, let's say, and the other goes to the individual eventually, but it goes through business, restaurants, hotels, office buildings. And so what's happened is that no wonder we had a shortage of toilet paper and some food items because we weren't ready for everybody to stay at home. We're expecting people to use bathrooms in both places. We're expecting people to eat tomatoes in both places, eat eggs in both places. And so what's happening now is that every day we stay closed, that supply chain is destroyed. And so it takes time for that to come back. Now, I believe it will come back, but it takes time, and that's why I'm looking for a U. I know it's not the perfect letter, but we're not going to be back to normal for quite some time, at least a couple of years. People think you can turn off an economy and then just turn it right back on. You can't. It doesn't work that way. And so my view is that the damage from this is going to end up being a lot more than people think.
Hope this doesn't become a way of life.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the biggest problem. Just imagine, running a business thinking that any day now, we could be shut down. There's a virus in China, and that's it. We're not going to take any risk. We're going to shut everything down again. And so how do you run a business or plan for the future if that's likely to be true? And I go back and look at how we behaved in other crises, SARS and MERS and the swine flu and HIV/AIDS. We never shut the economy down. I know I make these arguments and then I get called a denier and nobody wants to listen. But the CDC publishes death figures every week, and over 50,000 people a week. It's 52, 53, 54,000, but over 50,000 of people every week in the U.S. die. Now they die of tuberculosis, heart disease, cancer, auto accidents, gunshots. There's a lot of different ways people die, but it's 50,000 people a week, which means 2.6 million people every year. And yet we don't count these things up in the corner of a cable news show. We don't count the flu deaths up in the corner of a cable news show, even though we know somewhere between 25 and 60 million people die from the flu every year, or at least that's what we think we know. And so if we have now started down this road where we're not willing to take any risk at all, that's a dangerous thing. My analogy is, hey, if you play the game of football and you're a running back and the quarterback hands you the ball, and all of a sudden you start thinking, well, I could break my leg on this play. And then what you do is you fall down in the backfield. Well, guess what? There's no game of football. If everybody worries about getting injured on every single play, everybody stops playing. And that's the same thing with the economy. If we worry that any day it's going to come to an end, we're going to see a lot less risk-taking because we've just increased the risk of operating a business in this economy.
So scientifically driven industries, healthcare, public health especially, and they have models that have been consistently wrong for a long time.
Right.
That, and there's no method of discipline. I mean, if you were wrong all the time, right. I like you great, but you're on this show because you're a very serious guy, and you get things right. So isn't that odd? It's government. It's what it is.
Yep.
A friend of mine.
Exactly.
A friend of mine wrote complaining that Russ Vogt, whom I happen to know, who's in the Office of Management and Budget, was talking about cuts to the budget of the Centers for Disease Control. And my friend wrote and said, well, that's a crazy thing to do right now. And I said, well, there are two ways to look at that. One is look up what they're doing that doesn't have anything to do with communicable diseases, which is their original charter. Actually, they were founded to study communicable diseases for national defense purposes. And they spend a lot of money now on lifestyle health issues. In other words, that permits them to work very broadly, go all over the place, right? But the second thing is, if their job is the control of the disease, how are they doing? Have they won a raise? I mean, that's not,
Right.
If things ran like that around here at Hillsdale College, I'd be looking for a job.
Right. And that's why it's so, that's why the ability of these pandemic experts to use models that overestimate it means that both politicians and the modelers, the doctors, can claim victory at the end. And I'm not saying that they set it up exactly for that reason. I've found myself getting more cynical lately, but I'm not a pure cynic yet, and I hope I never am. But the bottom line, I don't think they purposely make the models high just so they can claim victory, but that's the end result, and that's a political process, and that's one of the problems with having government do this. And we hear about it all the time. If you're talking about climate change, well, then there's no way that ExxonMobil can ever have you do a study, because if you do, then it's tainted. Well, the government, as Milton Friedman said long ago, where are all these angels? Just because you're in government doesn't mean you're an angel. And people kind of gravitate toward more power. If you're a business, you want to have more customers, you want to have a bigger company, you want to make more profits. And if you're in government, you want to control more of activity, you want to have more power. It's the same thing. There are no angels. These are people. And when they have this kind of control over life, it's scary. And the good news is, what I see is that people in America, many people in America, are fed up. They're like, okay, we went along with you originally, but now we're looking at data, and we're seeing the data. And social media has a negative. It helps create panic. But it also has a positive, and that is it gives a voice to people that have alternative views. And I get it. There's people that attack you all the time. They call you a denier, etc. But at least those ideas can get out there and inform the public debate. I kind of look back, March 18th, I did a Twitter storm about the damage from the shutdown of the economy. The next day, and I'm not saying that they did this because of me, but the next day, the Wall Street Journal editorial page wrote an editorial about the damage done from shutting down the economy. Then a few days later, Dana Perino, who was one of the spokespeople in the Bush White House, said they ought to come up with an economic coronavirus task force, because we know the damage from the economy is something that we're not accounting for, and then it's sort of spread from there. And now that whole story was not to say that I started it or anything. I believe there's people that come up with the same ideas, hundreds, thousands of miles apart at the same moment. It's just because we're all looking at similar things. And so that was awesome. But with just in a few days, and then boom, the next thing you know, we're talking about, hey, when can we open up the economy? And so what's good about that is that we are starting to see the other side of this, and the sooner we open up, the less and long the damage will be, both short term and long term. The problem is we've done damage right now that's going to last at least a couple of years, and maybe longer. And I've said this a couple of times today. There's two big fears that I have. One is that we've made this a kind of a standard way, standard operating procedure for the future. All right, and the other problem is that government has just permanently grown. Everybody got a bigger budget out of that $2 trillion deal. A lot of it went to businesses and to individuals, but just about every agency in the government got more money. And so we have just permanently grown the size of the government. And so those two things worry me about the future. Bigger government means a smaller private sector, and then this standard operating procedure potential of shutting down the economy anytime we want. That's also going to mean the private sector behaves in a much less, they're going to have much more risk aversion than they would have otherwise, because now you've just added a whole new risk to their life.
Mm. I think the economy makes about $2 trillion a month. Is that right? The whole economy?
Yeah, roughly. Yeah, we're 22, 23 trillion a year.
So if you take a month off and nobody produces anything, that's what you lose. And
Yes.
that looks like then we've transferred money from the public sector to the private sector, paying all this money out. But the truth is, the public sector's borrowed the money, and the private sector is going to have to pay it back, and was the source of the money to begin with.
That's exactly right. So you could, in a way, almost think of it as a $4 trillion problem, because we lost $2 trillion in production, we added $2 trillion in future debt, actually more, because federal tax receipts are going to fall by probably 12 to 15% this year. I think we're going to lose $500 billion just in individual taxes because people aren't working. States and municipalities are losing sales taxes on top of that. And so what we have done is we've exploded. The budget deficit was already scheduled to be about $1 trillion. We added $2.2 trillion of new spending. Looks like this new bill is going to be $500. So add that up, it's $3.7 trillion. Then you take off $500 billion in revenue, and now you're at $4.2 trillion. So not only did we lose $2 trillion in production, but we have $4.2 trillion or more of debt that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to have to repay. And in economic terms, there's a theory out there called modern monetary theory. Most people it's been out there. MMT, AOC believes in this, and others. But that you can just print money and borrow money at will. The problem with that is that the only way you can ever make that money worth anything or pay back the debt is to produce. And if you only have a government, you're not producing. Government doesn't produce new things. I'm not saying that they don't fund research and we invent things because we went to the moon and into space that have changed, helped change the world. I'm not saying that but they aren't it's not the entrepreneurs. They don't create the wealth over time. It's the entrepreneurs that do. It's the small, mid, large businesses. It's the individual proprietors. Those are the people that create wealth. And without them, without producing, we can't pay back that debt. And so if today what we're doing is we're telling you, okay, you start a business, but if you don't have 3 months of cash on hand at all times, and we shut down because of the next virus, too bad, you're going out of business, or we're going to have to spend even more of your children's money to save you. You're much less likely to take risk. You're much less likely to be an entrepreneur. And that's one of the reasons why I go look. I added up Spain and Italy and France and Germany, 4 of the biggest countries in Europe. But then I added Belgium, Netherlands, and Switzerland. Now, I picked them kind of at random so I'd get reasonably close to the U.S.'s population. So those 7 countries have 292 million people. We have 330 million people. Well, guess what? In those countries, the total deaths from COVID are twice as high as ours. They're over 80,000 versus 40,000. And I believe one of the key reasons is that for decades they've grown slowly because they have big government, they have socialized medicine, and they've underinvested in their healthcare system. And so that's our future. We're going to end up having more people die because of slower growth than if we hadn't shut the economy down. And I fully get it. That if you're not out in public, you're not going to give it to anybody else. I totally understand that. But we've estimated the death rate as way higher than it really is. We're looking at Sweden, and they're not runaway, and they haven't closed their economy down. And so there's a lot of evidence that what we're doing is creating damage, which in the long run, maybe not next month or next year, but in the long run could create way more death than this virus today. And I don't know why our risk profile has changed so much. It's really amazing. Is it social media? Is it just the extent of news and how it's reported? Is it all politics? I'm not sure, but we've gone into a risk aversion, a cowering, or that running back in the backfield who will not take the ball from the quarterback because he might break his leg, and so that's what I see today happening in the economy, and it's one of the reasons why I do worry about the future.
Let's talk a little bit about what should be done now. What can the Congress and the President do to help get us out of this as fast as possible?
Yeah, so all right. If here's, I'd love to hear your comment on this, Larry, because you're a constitutional scholar, and sort of the way, if you're going to force businesses to shut down, isn't that really a taking, right? We could call it the equivalent of a taking, and then in a taking, there's supposed to be just compensation. So I'm just going to take this head on for a second and say, if the government forces you to shut down, then in a way it has to give you just compensation. So these loans to small businesses, the direct payment to people that are out of work, the use of Federal Reserve funds to kind of keep the markets calm and to provide liquidity to the markets, in a way that's just compensation for the taking. Now, we just talked about what that means for the future and having to pay back that debt, but in a way, that we're compensating people for the taking. Is that in your opinion, is that a good way to look at it constitutionally?
Oh, yeah.
Even though we know it might cause damage.
I think that's the way President Trump looks at it. By the way, he said things like that.
Yeah. All right. And so then, but here's what happens: is that we know that this is unsustainable because the damage keeps spreading, and every day it spreads further. The revenues to states and municipalities are falling. Businesses are going out that will never come back, and a lot of it has nothing to do with the money that the federal government is throwing at it. It's just because the risks of a lot of small businesses just operate on really thin margins, and can't last even a few weeks. And so we have to get this thing open. And here's kind of the way I see this happening. And we're already seeing a couple of dozen states, it looks like to me. I won't try to list them all. I probably missed 10 or add 2 that shouldn't be there. But some are beginning to open, and they're opening in phases. They're opening even wider than the president's guidelines, and they're doing it more quickly. And I think that starts to spread. So if Ohio opens, then Michigan and Indiana have more pressure to open, because now the companies in Ohio have an advantage over the companies in Michigan, and then the pressure on the governor or on the assembly grows to get things open. And then once if Ohio opens and Pennsylvania opens, then that puts pressure on New York City. In fact, New York City is now opening hospitals to do elective and needed surgeries finally. And so even Governor Cuomo, who promised to stay shut down until mid-May, is beginning to open things up. And so I think the pressure is going to build. Plus, we have people and companies who are just going to open. They're just going to go back to work. They're going to be out there. It's almost in a way civil disobedience, and what's I think that's just going to put. I think we're on the way. It is not going to take till the end of May. Now, if we have some major spike in new cases or something like that, which this is why I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. What I will say is that the data suggests to me that 30% of Americans have already had this. And so we are developing a herd immunity, just like we do with the flu. And the bottom line is I don't think we're going to see a new spike. But then again, please don't, come after me, for being wrong. But I don't think we will. But this pressure is going to spread. Now, so that would mean from the middle of March kind of until the early part of May, let's call it mid-May, for 2 months we've been shut down. that's a lot of damage to the economy, and it's going to take time to heal. And I'm not being pessimistic about this. I'm just saying it is, and it bums me out. We were at record high stock market highs, record low unemployment, and it's going to take us a couple of years to get back to where we were, as long as we don't shut it down again. And that's my biggest fear, is that it's not that we can't open and recover. You know, a lot of hedge funds out there now, I lost count of the billions of dollars, but it's probably over $100 billion, have started gathering funds to buy distressed debt, because there are going to be a lot of deals, pennies on the dollar kind of deals, to be able to buy firms that got into financial trouble because they had too much debt going into this and then didn't survive. Neiman Marcus just closed or went into bankruptcy the other day. And so there are people out there that see advantages that they can take and investments that they can make, and that's going to help get the economy open. That's the magic of creative destruction of capitalism and bankruptcy. I mean, it's because it allows money to be shifted into resources. One of the things that's going to happen, in my opinion, is that oil leases and the price of drilling rigs and equipment is going to fall, because there are some oil companies that had too much debt and can't survive. And so then those that had a lot of cash and a deep and well-structured balance sheet are going to be able to pick up leases and equipment cheaper. We saw this back in 2014 and 15 when oil prices fell. But what that'll do is it actually ratchets down the production costs in the Permian Basin, in the Bakken, in our shale fields. And so we'll be able to have a lower break-even point. And so bankruptcies, yeah, they're terrible for those who have to go through them, but for the economy as a whole, it allows us to restructure things, and sometimes we come out in a more efficient way. But it takes time, and that's why I'm saying it's going to be 2 years before we fully recover in the economy, probably a little bit less in the stock market because it will see the full recovery coming. But I always put the caveat on there, and that's if the government doesn't shut us down again, because they have done tremendous damage. And if they do it again, it will just make it mean that it's going to take a lot longer to get back to where we were.
So this is a sort of extreme form of the heavy regulatory taxing state.
Right.
And to the extent we go back to that, to the extent that this is a trigger for going back to that, then it could take a really long time to get back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, the more regulation we have, we saw it during President Obama's tenure. The higher the tax rates, the more regulation, the more government control, the slower we grow. And, we have, I think back about this last 10, 11, 12 years has been miraculous. Actually, if you look back at the last 30 years, it's been miraculous. When, even before that, Gordon Moore at Intel invents the computer chip, et cetera. But the iPhone 11, that stands for 11 years. It's only been around for 11 and a half, 12 years. That's it. The cloud has been around less. Apps have been around less. And I think about what we are able to do. The good news is business, even though it was all stay at home, a lot of business still was getting done because of the technologies that we've invented. And that's the only way we were able to grow, I believe, in President Obama's tenure, is because government got bigger. And a lot of libertarians and a lot of us Austrians said, oh no, we're going to be in depression any day. And my argument always was, look, I don't like higher taxes, I don't like more regulation, but technology is so powerful today. The cloud, apps, the smartphone, the iPad, all of the 3D printing. We cracked the genome, and by the way, one of the reasons why I expect a vaccine to come more quickly is because we cracked the genome. We can now model these things on computers and be pretty certain that we've got the right thing. It's like building an airplane. You can model it on a computer without a part and know that it will fly. All right, and so cracking the genome is I mean, I think we're going to have healthcare companies and biotech companies come out of this as heroes. And so let me tell you the opposite way that this could go, and that is that we're going to find out that the CDC and the FDA did not save our lives, that this virus was way more prevalent than we thought, that the death rate is much closer to the flu, and that we panicked for no reason, and we're never going to let that happen again. And not only that, but it was the private companies, the Roches, the Abbotts, the 3D printers who are now doing nasal swabs, and and they're printing millions and millions and millions and millions of them that literally saved the day. And if that story can be put out there, along with the fact that socialism and social welfare states in Italy, Spain, and France failed relative to us, they closed down their economies too. But they have a lot more deaths, and it's because their healthcare system didn't have enough investment in it. And so I kind of can see this go one of two ways: that we embrace the private sector for its victories, and we point the finger at the government for its failures, and that's going to be the battle for the narrative as we come out of this. But it is going to be the drug companies and the biotech firms that are the ones that develop the vaccines, the antibody tests, and testing in general, that roll things out that are going to be able to make people more comfortable. We're also going to see that they can move faster than ever before. And this is one of the things the president has done, is he's kind of forced the FDA to kind of calm down, to stop slowing people down in their research. And I think, the more the FDA looks at this, the more they're going to realize that cracking the genome, especially when it comes to a virus, was one of the most important developments of our lifetimes, and in healthcare, that is. And it's going to let us move faster on vaccines than we ever have before. So that could be a real positive that comes out of this as well.
So, Brian, that's our time, and I want to say two things. Lincoln said if we could know where we are and whether we are attending, we could better know what to do and how to do it. You've helped with that a mountain. And I am grateful to you for teaching me economics every Monday morning. I invite the rest of you to go learn from him. And Brian, thank you very much.
Larry, thank you. So great to have been with you.